then it shows an impairment of self-confidence.
Yeah, it's just because of insecurity. And
Hey guys, welcome thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me in this sort of journey I'm undertaking here. This is an area of thought, of engagement, of thinking, of wrestling, of growing through that is relatively new for me. This is not something I've been studying academically for a long time, and now I'm just throwing my my expertise at you. Actually, this comes for me very much out of a personal journey, having to do with the fact that that I become increasingly aware and acutely aware of what climate anxiety does to us, individually, but also as groups. The way in which we're looking into a future that is actually somehow too scary to look into the eye properly. Also, that is, in the words of Timothy Morton, a hyper-object, something that we cannot actually oversee and begin to oversee. And engaging with that, that which what may for some people seem like far away, but we see the changes, we see what is happening in climate, in temperatures, in weather, etc. That makes us scared. And I feel a need to engage with that anxiety, not necessarily to solve it or to take it away, but to find new language, to find new practices, to find new engagements, so that we're not just scared, or not just in denial, or not just running for technical solutions. So this is where my engagement comes from, and why I've spent the last half year or so really diving through a number of literatures to not get sort of so much the precise academic state-of-the-art where they are at in your advanced sustainability course, but rather to carve out a language that is rich, that is generous, that is giving us something to look forward to, even if the future looks dark. Also to get towards a vision of what it is to be human that is somehow not just less in the future, not just about less traveling or less consumption or less this or less that or less that, but actually that we can find ways of becoming more human. That we can actually land ourselves in a future that is probably going to be violent and complicated and difficult and dark and in many ways not pleasant, but still invites us to a fuller humanity. So this is where I'm coming from, and I'm so glad you're joining me on this journey. That the words that I speak somehow seem to resonate, and that you want to be companions on figuring this thing out somehow. So this is the second lecture of 3. The first one was about learning how to die. Today we're going to talk about learning to be born, and then next Monday we'll talk about what it means to live together beyond the human. So, as a beginning, last lecture was about death, and death is the end, right? And the Anthropocene that we're facing is the end of the world. Left or right, that is somehow going to happen. Right? We're facing the end of the world. But what world means is not just one thing. World is not just a set of things or a set of beings that then die. A world is always a significant place, a significant whole. It is the whole of all the things put together that give meanings to who we are, what we're doing, why we're doing that, etc. So the Anthropocene is not so much just a destructive event, but it's a transformation. It's a transformation, it's a paradigm shift, a transformation of the background of how we understand ourselves to be in this world, in this universe. And therefore, as such, it is a transformational process. We are going to change profoundly. And that change is going to be hurting and feels like death in many ways. But it also will transform us somehow into something different. It is a process of death and rebirth. And last time I talked about this in terms of crisis. A crisis is a turning point. Right? That's the etymology of the word. It's a turn. And a crisis typically is a story that ends. A story that we had about ourselves, or that I had about myself, that somehow crashes. And that then I find myself without a story about who I am in this world and what my world is about. And we all experience such moments of crisis when people die that we care about, or when good friendships or relationships end, or when we are in a depression, or those kinds of things. The story that we had about who we are and what our world is somehow no longer functions. It got stuck. It was already dead, and we dragged it on for days or months or even years, until at some point we started realizing, okay, I need to let this go. Right? But the crisis is also always a rebirth. There is a new story that wants to be born, a new story that is already emerging, and that has been submerged and that can never find voice. And this is the transformation, allowing ourselves through this story change, and with in between a moment of not knowing anything. So the metaphor for crisis that I like to use is the one of falling. Feels like the ground falls away under your feet. When you hear this news, you always try to avoid, right? You feel like you're falling. There's nothing that gives you security, and you're just in a void going down and down and down. There's no control, there's no grip. There's pure anxiety and nothing to hold on to. But simultaneously, crisis is understanding. It's a deep understanding. If you've gone through a burnout or a depression or a difficult breakup with a significant other, you probably know this experience of how deep and enriching that painful moment is. How it gives you a deeper sense of what is valuable, what is meaningful in the world, what is truly you, right? To the reconnection to what is really important to you, what is authentic within you. So it is verstehen in German, understanding. It is a restanding. You find a new way of standing in the world. Facing up to a truth that was always there, already emerging. A truth that we just tried to look away from and not look into the eye for so long. But now it dawned upon us we were having no defense anymore. We let it overwhelm, fell, and bang. And now we can handle this difficult truth. We're standing under it, this understanding. We have no way of standing above it. Right? We have no superior epistemology here. The only thing that we can do is look at it from below. And of course, the truth or the crisis of our century is the Anthropocene, properly speaking, namely that we no longer have the ability to significantly isolate the word human from nature. Those two things are no longer detachable. What it is to be nature is to be human from now on. What it is to be human is to be nature from now on. That's the thing. That's the truth that's been calling us for so long. So in the last lecture I talked about this in terms of the Western or the modern cosmogram. Right? The picture that we drew of our cosmos. The background against which all of our actions seem to make a lot of sense. Right? That is the whole, that is the story, that's the paradigm that is crashing right now. That's the thing that is dying and that we emerge from. And this is a story about what it is to be modern. And to be modern is to be, in the words of Latour, confused. Is to be utterly confused. Because what it is to be modern is to confuse ideal things with real things. And to constantly have a category overlap between something that actually doesn't exist with something that does exist. And then thinking that that is somehow real. So this is why we discussed in the last lecture words as objective or universal or the laws of nature and the causal laws of nature, which are none of them actually true, none of them actually real, but which we have taken for centuries to be actually more real than the things that we could actually see in nature. We started reading nature through abstractions that don't actually exist and started ending up drawing a picture of nature in those abstract terms. And simultaneously, on the flip side of that, we started taking up a position, a point of view that we actually couldn't inhabit and then call that true. Right? This is the view from nowhere, where we are in this weird cultural moment for the last 3 centuries or so that we think that actually the view from nowhere is true and that we somehow have access to it, which we constantly don't. And then we're constantly conflating what we're actually observing from where we are with our perspectives and our way of looking and our backgrounds and our cultural predispositions, etc., 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 with a neutral position towards the universe. So this has been the makeup of an epistemological disaster. Namely, the fact that we've completely misread nature for centuries. And that our picture of nature, one of a passive environment that is just there to enable human agency, is profoundly wrong. So where in 1610 Galileo said to the Inquisition, and yet the earth moved, we're supposed to have mumbled that. Now, 4 centuries later, we astonishedly say, and yet the earth is moved, is responsive, is actually kicking back to us, is actually engaging with us. Or, as Latour puts it, the new Inquisition, henceforth economic rather than religious, is shocked to learn that the earth has become again, an active, local, limited, sensitive, fragile, trembling, and easily irritated envelope. And simultaneously, our understanding of the earth as a globe, as a falling body among falling bodies, became actually a process of globalization. right? Where we started mapping out what it is to be modern in terms of moving from the local to the global. And the local became visible to us as all that is archaic, all that is traditional, absolute, old-fashioned, conservative, local, particular, weird. Right? And if you want to move ahead, and in modernity there is no choice, you want to move ahead, you will want to become modern, you will want to progress, there's no two ways about it. The only way is up. The only way is to go global. And this story of globalization, this is a story we've been telling for at least 50 years. And it was a story of what Latour calls globalization plus. Everybody gets to join. You can go global, and you can go global, and you can go global. All of us will go global. Except that that was not true. Except that that was a lie all along. Except that we do not have planet enough to facilitate globalization plus. And we never had. It was a lie from the beginning. What we have is globalization minus. Globalization for the happy few. Globalization for the 1%. But it's even worse than that. Because it's not as if the rest of the planet can then simply stay within the local. No. In the globalization, we have destroyed the local. There's no local to go back to. We do not have access to that anymore. We're stuck. We're in an airplane that was headed for the global and had to return because that airport is not available. And now we hear the captain speaking. This is your captain speaking. The local also isn't available. We have to get off the axis of local to global. Because that framework no longer is accessible to us. So here we get at the end of the modern myth. The story that held us together, that created beauty, that created war, that created famine, that created art. It did so much, but it has crashed. And Latour puts it like this. How can we deem realistic a project of modernization that has forgotten for 2 centuries to anticipate the reactions of the terraqueous globe to human actions? How can we accept as objective economic theories that are incapable of integrating into their calculations the scarcity of resources whose exhaustion it has been their mission to predict? How could we speak of effectiveness with respect to technological systems that have not managed to integrate into their design a way to last more than a few decades? How can we call rationalist an ideal of civilization guilty of a forecasting error so massive that it prevents parents from leaving an inhabited world to their children? If modernity was about being realistic, about being objective, about being effective, and about being rational, these words no longer serve their purpose. They're part of the story that has to die and be born again. So we have to come down to earth. We have to come down from the heavens of modernity, where we were with our heads in the clouds. As Latour puts it, he who looks at earth as a globe always sees himself as a god. We have to let go of that global view, knowing and acknowledging that we cannot go back to that local, no matter what Brexit tells you, no matter what Bolsonaro tells us, or what Trump tells us. There is no going back to a local except in terms of a nostalgic invented tradition that is used as a way of excluding others. But it's not a true local. So what we are facing is a transformation. Not to become local or try to stay global, but to become earthbound, to become terrestrials, and to start inhabiting dwelling places with our companion species. So this is what it is to learn to be born. This is what this is all about, right? And what I want to carve out in like the coming 25 minutes. The question of what comes after death, what comes after crisis, what is the beginning, in Timothy Morton's terms, after the end? How do we embark on a story that was always subsumed, always sort of marginalized by the big story that we had, but that is wanting to emerge? So I want to carve that out in two ways. Following the metaphor of being born as a baby, as a child, right? There's two things going on that I want to highlight. First of all, there's a you coming into the world, but with the you-ness that comes into the world comes to you. Right? There's a you and the world that come to being together. And simultaneously, there is a learning that comes with language. When we grow up as children, we learn language, and through that language we can start speaking the world into existence. And again, the language comes to us and we're speaking it. It is not separate one way or the other. Those two are part of the same thing. Of course, in many ways this transformation hasn't happened yet, and I don't know, this is not a prediction, I don't pretend to know what is going to happen, I just want to position a couple of markers that sort of help us get a feel for what such transformation might look like, and what kind of the puzzles and challenges and possibilities are going to be for navigating such an unknown as such a civilizational transformation. And yet, on the other hand, however impossible it is to know this, it is already emerging. It is already somewhere around. Small beginnings, small starting points. They're there already. Sometimes difficult to see because, yeah, they just look very idealistic or non-serious or not relevant or whatever. But they're already there. The story is already growing. So, birth of a new being. What happens if a new being is born? It's not about the body. I think I made that clear. But nor is it about the mind. It's not that we just have a psychological reset. What happens is more profound. This takes place at the level of our being in the world. To be born again is to develop a new being in the world, or what Heidegger calls a Dasein. Where your Dasein, your being there, includes you somehow and the world that you inhabit. Those two are linked together. They're mutually constitutive. Dasein is its world, Heidegger says. The old Western metaphysics of our Dasein was one of an I against an environment or a set of things, a world of it, that I that now am separate from. Think about Descartes' cogito ergo sum, where the highest form of thinking was located in an isolated brain, me thinking. Right? This is the story that is going. And the rebirth that we're facing is going to open up different kinds of Dasein that include other entities, other species. So you're born. You come out of the womb. First thing you do, you cry. Right? And that cry is the moment of birth. Because that's when you really land in the new world. And the cry is the lung filling up with air for the first time, and the hurt that must cause. and then simultaneously the scream that comes out of it, and none of it is mediated through language or symbolic anything, right? It is pure, direct, inhabiting a body, responding to the body, responding to the world. Right? To be born again is to not have access to knowledge, the ability to symbolically interpret what is going on, but actually to only be forced to fall back to what is most authentically yours, in this case pain, your bodily pain. So birth is embodiment. Birth is finding your most elemental being again, getting back to that thing that we moderns have been running away from so long, trying to avoid the body and by sticking into the mind for such a long time. And when you're a baby, you don't have a distinction between you and the world. That comes later. That comes way later when you're at least according to Freud, when your mother sort of withdraws from you. Then you start developing a sense of a self and a non-self. But as you're being born, you're pure openness. There's no functional separation between you and the world. This is where you start from. This is where our birth begins. And from there on, we start developing new sensitivities. We start developing our senses. We start developing our taste. We start developing our ears, our eyes. Everything has to be trained, has to grow, because everything is still new. We don't know anything yet. There's no knowledge that is actually helping us in any regard. All we can do is grasp, push, pull, taste, put to our face, feel. Right? So learning comes directly through experience of the world. Learning is encounter. Learning is interaction. Learning is not only moving things, but also being moved by things. And the things that are moving me or that I am moving are not abstract entities, they are not its, they are all relational. There is no I and it, but there is an I and thou, in the sense that everything is meaningful, everything is significant to us. Everything is what Donna Haraway calls a significant otherness. That I have to relate myself to, but I cannot stabilize it in terms of, oh, this is a thing. So what it is to start feeling is to be relational, constantly, all the way down. And from there on, we start inhabiting a place. We no longer have access to a global. We don't even have access to a concept of space. Instead, we have a place. The place that we inhabit. But the place is not the old local. It is just a place where our interactions unfold. Timothy Morton puts it like this: the ecological era is the revenge of place. Right? So the Anthropocene is the revenge of place. We've tried to unplace the world by globalizing it, and now place is taking its revenge. But it's not your grandfather's place. Because place is not a space, it's not an empty thing, it is the constant movement of things. So place doesn't stay still. It bends and twists. Place is a twist that you can't iron out of the fabric of things. Our place is not a geographical positionality. Our place is the relationship with the entities around us. How they push us, how they pull us, how they interact with us, how they move us, how we move them. That is our place. That is where we are born into. This is a terrestrial place, and it is our dwelling place. This is where we can grow up. This is also where we can start belonging. And in that place we start growing up, and we grow up in Gaia. We no longer think of nature, as a mechanical clockwork machine of regularities that are true across the board because we found objective universal laws that guide them. No, that's the old nature. But now we find ourselves in Gaia. Gaia, just a mess. It's a multi-species muddle. There's constant feedback loops. There's things happening. I do something, and another entity does something back. And it's never completely regular. It's also not it's completely unregular. There's regularity to it. But there's always something more or less happening than we would anticipate. Each agency, Latour has it, modifies its neighbors, however slightly, so as to make its own survival less improbable. That's Gaia. It's not that I influence you or I act upon you, but I change you, just as you change me. Just as the bacteria that make up so much more of my body than the organs that we call human, change me and shape me. And here again, the same quote I put in last time, we become subjects through that constant interaction, where being a subject doesn't mean acting in an autonomous fashion in relation to an objective context. Being a subject means sharing agency with other actors who have also lost autonomy. We become co-emergence. We are not free to do whatever we want because we're bound to our dwelling places, to the interactions that we have. But in that, we can become actors, agents, and subjects. So we start learning. And learning comes through weirdness, as Morton calls it. Where weird means both strange, but also loops. And the loops are the constant feedback that we get when we engage and something happens back to us, and we engage again, and we see constantly what we do coming back at us. Knowledge that doesn't come through abstraction, but it comes through knowing being thrown back to itself. I do something to you, it comes back to me. So we learn through the experience of feedback loops. What is at stake in the Anthropocene is this order of understanding. Latour says, we have to slip into, envelop ourselves within a large number of loops so that gradually, step by step, knowledge of the place in which we live can be experienced. Not written down in the midterm exam, not known from above, but experienced. If we are born again in Gaia, doesn't mean we can't think abstractly, it doesn't mean we have to dump philosophy or whatever, but we learn through experience, feedback loops. And then we start encountering things, entities, beings, all kinds of. And we learn through them. But what we see in those encounters is that everything comes with finitude. Rather than having a position of saying to know, I know what this is a cup of water, I know, because I've studied the table of elements, and I know what this thing is made of, and so I know what this thing is. I no longer have that perspective. I start learning to encounter things through experience and discover that there's only so little that I can actually know, see, experience of something as simple as a glass. There's this constant excess in things, that there's too much that we can't know, that I can't be part of, that I can't get to of the thing in itself, right? And that lack makes for a constant sense of wonder, constant sense of not feeling in total control, right? That means also that things constantly act and respond to me in unforeseeable ways. I am no longer able to reduce the world to mere things that I can sort of stabilize in this category of objects. I can only engage with my world through encounter, through engagement, knowing that all this engagement comes with a finitude, comes with a mystery, comes with a sense of wonder that I can't eradicate from my everyday life. I cannot know the companion species that I am running around with in my dwelling places. I cannot pretend to know what they are, how they think, or what it is like to be a bat. But that doesn't mean I can't be in a meaningful relation to them. That doesn't mean that I cannot have practices and engagement with them that are somehow meaningful to all of us. And from here on, we start studying a new language, the language of nature, the language of Gaia. This is a language where human overlaps with nature, and where we no longer are able to reduce language to something like a purely human phenomenon. Eduardo Kahn, who I'm going to draw on for this section, puts it like this: the world beyond the human is not a meaningless one made meaningful by humans. The world itself is already meaningful, is semiotic. It is thick with rich meanings. And those meanings are not reducible to human language. In other words, there is language in nature, and we can start to learn to listen to that. We can start learning to listen to Gaia. So how does that work? Kahn, using the language philosophy of Charles Peirce, identifies 3 levels of language. There's iconic language, indexical language, and symbolic language. Together they create language, the 3 of them together. But they do so at different levels. Iconic language is basically language that mimics sounds or things in nature. Indexical language are basically events, I'll get to that in a moment, that are meaningful. And symbolic language is language that we think of as language, is our ability to have words and concepts and sort of make them refer to entities in the world or to other words and concepts. All 3 together are language. And what makes us humans slightly unique is that we have a lot of symbolic language. But the rest of nature shares iconic and indexical language with us. It's even worse. The symbolic language that we have is not a God-given thing that comes from the sky. Actually, it's just a further evolution of indexical and iconic language that is already in nature. Right? It is not separate from, it flows from, it is extensive from, it is part of that same thing. So we produce signs, meaningful things at all those 3 levels. So that signs do not necessarily reside in sounds or events or in words, nor are they exactly in bodies or in minds. Signs are going to be the texture of nature. They are ongoing relational processes. Signs are alive. Language is a live thing in nature that we can start learning. How does this work? Kohn brings in the example of the Runa, indigenous peoples in the Amazon rainforest. And he brings an example of the Runa wanting to hunt a monkey. And the monkey is in a high perch, high branch of a tree, too high for them to shoot it with a bow and arrow. So what they do is they cut down a palm tree nearby. And when the palm tree is cut, it falls, causing the monkey to startle and jump to a lower perch where they can shoot it. Now, the falling tree may not be a symbolic sign to the monkey. It may not be that the monkey thinks, hey, there's a tree falling. If a tree falls, that means that in the future that doesn't actually exist. I might actually get hurt unless I jump to a lower branch of this tree. It may be that the monkey does that, but it's not necessarily the case. It's also not necessarily that it does. The monkey responds to the falling tree by jumping to another branch. But even though it's not symbolic what the monkey does, it's also not mechanistic. There is an interpretation going on. There is a meaning going on in the falling of the tree. That's where the language lies. And in responding to that meaning, the jumping monkey itself becomes also an index. Right? It is also a meaningful event that can cause other things to happen or do. So these are chains of semiotic, meaningful events that run through nature all the time without necessitating symbolic language altogether. But also not using a language that is foreign to us, because we all also do speak iconic and indexical signs. We're part of that. Or as Cohn puts it, a crashing palm tree taken as sign is alive, insofar as it will come to be interpreted by a subsequent sign, the monkey, in a semiotic chain that extends into a possible future. So, being born in Gaia, we grow up in constant feedback loops, which are constant indexical signs, not communicating to us through symbolic language, but through thick, semiotic, significant response. And that's the language that we can learn how to speak. And this is thought. The book that I used from Eduardo Cohn is how forests think for Cohn. That thought is alive. It is what happens when the tree falls, when the monkey jumps, and whatever follows after that. Includes humans and non-humans. We are even produced by such signs. He says selves, human or non-human, simple or complex, are the outcomes of semiosis as well as new starting points for new sign interpretations, whose outcome will be its future self. A self is a waypoint in a semiotic process. We're in a constant storytelling. Gaia is a constant storytelling, of which selves, beings, humans and non-humans, we're like nodes. We're like connection points between those stories. Okay, getting to wrapping up. But we had listening, and now we're going to go speaking. We learn how to speak when we're born again. Takes a while. First we stutter our way through it, but at some point we start speaking as new beings. And we give names to things. this is old. This is old stuff of mythologies, right? So you have Adam and Eve, or whatever religion you have, and they're thrown upon a meaningful world. And what they start doing, they start giving names. They start giving names to things, because naming things is worlding. It's like creating a meaningful environment, a meaningful place, a meaningful belonging in the world. But naming things properly is not just us throwing a word upon something else. Naming things properly is finding the word that they respond to, that they would understand to be their name. So that naming is not simply a colonization of the one by the other, but it becomes an act of recognition of another. In the sense that what is called by name is called into a presence, but it calls itself back because it responds, because it recognizes its name. It is named, it has a name. And by speaking names, we in this way, together with Gaia, together with the entities that we co-inhabit our dwelling places with, we set the terms of our new world. And that determines what we start seeing, what we can start engaging with, what we can count as knowns to some extent and unknowns. Setting the stages for our actions. And one thing that names, we can start telling stories. And that's what humans do. So this is the thing we're so fond of, that we so need to do all the time. Storytelling, 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 storytelling. Like spiders create webs, we create webs of stories, endless stories about who we are and what the world is, right? But these are going to be different stories. And that's a good thing, because as Donna Haraway has it, it matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledges know knowledges. It matters what worlds worlds. And it matters what stories tell stories. Storytelling is worlding. Storytelling is the ability to create and sustain and transform worlds that we inhabit. Every story co-shapes what is experientiable in the world for us. It sets the markers, the space, and the encounters that are going to be meaningful to us. Storytelling is also always moral, always about right and wrong. We always have to include in our stories, even if those are scientific stories, some sense of what is valuable and what is not so valuable. So this is where we land. We can start telling new stories together with others. We can start speaking the world into existence in terms of multi-species stories. No longer stories about humans against a backdrop, but stories about terrestrials in their dwelling places. So concluding, learning to be born. Learning to be born is letting go, dying, letting the old story go, letting the epistemology of superiority go, letting objectivity go, falling, and landing in Gaia, not having words, not having knowledge, being in touch with our bodied self, developing new sensitivities. And from there we develop a new being in the world, where what is my being is also my world, and what is my world is also my being. Becomes very touchy, becomes very feely, becomes very experiential. And we're learning a new language. We can learn to listen to nature. We can learn to listen to indexical and iconic language. But we can also speak the world into a new existence. So that's my message for today. I just want to iterate that this is not just a story about a possible future. This is also a story about what is already emerging right now. So maybe there are baby steps, maybe there are beginnings, maybe there are already these kind of practices somewhere here and there, hidden in our everyday lives. Right? So we could start looking for those. We could start engaging with those, strengthening them if we encounter them. And these come around questions like, where am I already inseparable from the world around me, from nature, from Gaia? Where am I already developing sensitivities towards nature around me, companion species, other entities? Where can I already listen? Where can I already listen to what is never being listened to because we don't consider it to be language? But it's always spoken around and through us, even in our cities, even in our campuses. And how can I speak and name the world differently so that I can see it respond differently? How can I speak the world so that it responds because it's recognized, because I've called it by its name? That's it. Thank you very much. Any questions or thoughts?
I'm just more thinking about what your thoughts are on this, because the predictions about our future with climate change are a prime example of kind of the fruits of the view from nowhere.
Yeah.
As in that we think about what would happen to the world if we were outside of it, and kind of tailor and tinker with the variables. So it might be that if we take up a position from somewhere, that this problem is not visible anymore. Or that at least the issue that called our new way of thinking into being doesn't look like an issue anymore, or at least changes in nature. And I was wondering if you thought that this is a natural part of it, or that this actually poses something to be overcome.
There are multiple stories to tell. Heidegger distinguishes between ontic and ontological. There's an ontic story to tell. An ontic story is about bodies and spaces and countries and institutions and stuff like that. Stuff that we meet in everyday life. I'm not suggesting that we just run away from those and not care about them. But that's a story that we're constantly telling. What I'm trying to get towards is a slightly deeper story. That is not going to be in place of, but it's going to be, on the other hand, it's going to be more profound than. It's going to speak to another level. It's not speaking to survival. It's speaking to transformation. It's not speaking to avoiding outcomes. It is speaking to the question of how human are we now? In this crazy world that we've created, in which we've become so completely detached, fragmented, isolated from what is our belonging in the world. So it's not a story about trying to maintain what is there, but rather about aiming for something that is actually more beautiful. But I can also completely see that we shouldn't do the one without the other somehow, or whatever. But there are different levels, and I think there's they need to be both there somehow. What it is to be human is also to do banal stuff that has to do with institutions and work, etc. What is it to be human is also something deeper that transcends, that is whatever you want to call it, spiritual or and if we're not both, there's something wrong. And I think the same goes for normalcy as for crisis in that matter.
You were talking about the birth starts with crying, or birth is the moment of crying. And I think at some point you said that things return to pain, and how pain is, the pain of breath entering the lungs for the first time. And my question is what you think about that, whether that rings true with what you intended to say in the reading of it, or to what extent do you think everything is sort of connected to pain?
I cannot speak with any sort of academic authority about this. But what I do know is that the moments in my life that came with the most intense pain were the moments of deepest transformation for me. So that I indeed associate a certain kind of suffering, the suffering of crisis. I mean, for the baby to be born is a crisis as well, right? So you're safe in the womb and everything is cool and you're just splashing around, right? And all of a sudden you're forced out of it. There's this, I didn't even talk about the narrow pathway, which is, I think there's a whole story to be told about that as well. But then the encounter with the outside world is this transformation where the body isn't ready for the new thing, so it must hurt. But that hurt becomes the ability to engage. Is that sort of answering you?
Yes.
Yeah?
I'm a little confused about like the idea of this Western cosmogram, and I mean I've been understanding it as like the idea of like a white Christian hegemony, and like I like the idea of falling out of this cosmogram and into Gaia, but I feel like so many people are so I mean, first, if you can maybe distinguish if it's more or less than this white Christian hegemony that has taken over most of the Western world, and how you suggest that many people who are really deeply embedded in the culture that has been created by this, like, can escape from it when they're not in positions of power, and how to do it in our own lives.
So, I would say the worst place to try to escape your cosmogram is actually from a position of power, because that's where you're the most embedded. That's where you're the most part of the paradigmatic thinking, right? It is only marginality gives you a feel of how that cosmogram is actually violent and hurtful. So it would necessarily begin with some form of marginality. I don't. So the cosmogram as a paradigm, as a story that is such a meta story that we're not even telling it as a story, but it's just the background for the stories that we tell. That thing is so big that it's almost impossible to escape. And the only way that I can articulate what I did today is against the logic of that cosmogram, for instance. I am that thing. I've grown out of it. It's something that has just shaped the sort of the foundational points in my thinking, my being, my acting, my whatever I am. That doesn't mean we can't bend it. Doesn't mean it can't change. There was a time that we weren't modern. there was a time that we were white and Christian, but not modern, for instance. There was a shift going on there. There's been times that we weren't Christian. Those things come through eras, through phases, and through what is called paradigm shifts. And paradigm shifts are moments when things flip. There's sort of a build-up against, this is all Kuhn's work, there's a build-up that sort of starts pushing the old story out of its balance. And then somehow, at some point, you only need a little bit to happen, and the whole story flips. Of course, that doesn't take place in 1 year or 2 years. That is something in human history that takes decennia. But it flips. Right? And of course, the Enlightenment period was, for the Western world, such a paradigm shift. What I am suspecting, what I am intuiting, what I am listening to is that we're facing one of those shifts, that one of them is coming. And that this is going to be a hard one, because it's not just a change in our thinking, but it's also a change in the material environment. It's going to be a change in the literal world, right? So it's not just that we're thinking our world differently, but the world is responding to us in a different way, and that's going to go hand in hand with a lot of crisis.
So you mentioned that in the Anthropocene, it's really hard to imagine the human without the natural without the human.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of lost in this Venn diagram of natural and human, because I would almost say that the human has been naturally occurring. So
Yeah.
where do you place that?
So the fascinating thing, what it is about being modern, is that we have two conflicting stories about what it is to be human that we can't put together somehow. So on the one hand, we're perfectly okay to say, well, we're an outcome of evolution, we're biological, etc. That we don't have a problem with that, except that we never understand that to be the qualifying marker of what it is to be human. Because what it is to be human for us is always a metaphysical, meta-natural story about a rationality or about something else that is actually culture. Right? And then we have two stories about human that is, on one hand, nature, and then you go to the hospital, and then culture, and that is something else. And we can't, Latour talks about this in the first chapter of Facing Gaia, that is sort of, it creates a double vision. We're constantly flipping between, we can't stabilize what it is to be human in terms of human nature. We're just flipping according to situations. What we're facing up to, what we're landing into in the Anthropocene, in Gaia, would be the ability to let go of that double vision. Where being natural unproblematically overlaps with being human somehow, without reducing then what it is to be human to something that feels unhuman. So without that being disparaging, is what we feel now, right? If we understand ourselves to be animals, there's something wrong with that. So I would say that that's sort of it. The modern story is one of constant flipping between categories and being very unrestful, not being able to stabilize. And I have the hope, at least, that in Gaia we'll be able to stabilize more.
So you have been talking a lot about either like very abstract level humanity or the individual level transformation, but so how would you see this in the middle range, like in our neighborhoods, communities, friend groups, schools, whatever, so this sort of transformation?
So I like that question a lot, because this is the level where the transformation is going to take place. If it's not going to be there, it's not going to happen. It can never be an individual thing, but it can also not take place at global humanity or even national levels, because that community is exactly that thing, those dwelling places, that belonging in the co-inhabiting spaces, places I should say, that are real and meaningful. What it is to be a community and you guys here at UC, you know this, is actually precisely the sense of subjectivity, of being subjective to each other's whims and each other's bad moods and each other's responses. You are, as a community, a proper community, not a Facebook community, you are, in a sense, a co-emergent being in a locality. Right? So that should be the level of the transformation. And that means that we have to stop understanding humanity as one thing. There's going to be humanities that are going to be different in different places. Latour says we have to come up with as many definitions of humanity as there are forms of belonging on Earth. But that's not individual, that comes exactly at this communal level.
I'm gonna be an aggressively 20-year-old white guy, and I'm gonna try to play a bit of devil's advocate here.
So
It's a very-
what's different than yesterday?
Because the thing is, like, I feel like I share like an optimism, I feel like there's within what you're saying, with all the like pain and all that, there's an optimistic outlook in that. That there is an ability in us to die and be reborn in a world where we understand the non-human and the human as oneness, where we kind of go in that. But how do we know that we are just not going to be stuck in a horrible situation, clinging on to our bad cosmogram for an insane amount of time? That we kind of like, you gave an example of like, you can have a dead relationship and then it's been dead for quite some time, and then you break it off and you have that pain point. But what if that pain point never truly comes?
There's a misunderstanding here.
Mm-hmm.
Hope is not certainty of outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Hope is actually the act of standing sovereign amongst situations or under situations that are too big for us to oversee. Hope is the act of standing, where what it is to be human doesn't let itself be exhausted by the hardships that we're facing. So when it comes to hope as hoping for a good outcome, I'm not so with hope. And I'm very much with Latour that was saying that we need to learn to dishope. But hoping as taking a stance, taking a bet, taking a wager on the basis of too little information and actual knowledge. But this is just what I'm standing for. That's one that I could live with. I hope I sufficiently not answered your question.
Just sort of thinking out loud, am I correct to say that you were speaking about three types of language? So the iconic and the indexical would be sort of the experiential learning kind of language, as opposed to the symbolic, which is based on abstractions?
Yeah, but yeah, you could, but it's more than experiential. The iconic language is also when you use words that mimic a sound, for instance.
Yeah, so let's say more about the indexical, which is
Yeah.
experiential, because I'm trying to think again very fundamentally, if as a human mind or even other animal minds work, if it's possible to push that symbolic abstractive interpretation away, and if it doesn't even exist already with the indexical. That's what I've been sort of struggling with the last few minutes. Does that make sense?
I'm not completely sure I follow.
Neither do I. But
there certainly is a level of symbolic language that we use, because I can use terms like symbolic language. And that's how it's defined. That level of language is not separate from the way I walk around here, the way my voice changes in my sentences, etc., all of which you pick up on while I'm doing this, and that you are listening. You're listening my words through a whole shitload of other stuff. And that is all indexical. So that language is also there constantly. But then there's much more because in many ways this building is indexical, etc. All of it is thick meaning. So there's thick meaning in it whether we as humans perceive it or not. But in the engagement of nature, that thick meaning is always there. Is that sort of helping you navigate your question?
Yeah, I think so. It's just trying to wrap my mind around fundamentally changing the sort of the mixture between which I don't know how, if it's possible to even think that way, if that makes sense.
So that depends on how you define thinking. But read Cohen's book because he says forests think. So there's something wrong with the way we use the word thinking in the sense that we carve out only a very thin layer of what thinking is and then pretend that that is all thinking that is there to be done. Because actually the thought is alive. That is his argument. Whether you buy it or not, well, that's dependent on the book, of course. But the thought is alive in the tree falling, in the monkey jumping, but also in the humans deciding to cut down the tree. Right? And that thought is this semiotic unfolding of action and reaction, but not mechanistically, not in the Galilean way, but rather through every action and reaction being meaningful and therefore having to be interpreted by an interpretant, as he calls it, that then becomes a new index for another interpretant. So that's how the chain sort of works.
Let me ask a related question. So it's about finding a new language. And I was wondering if you meant like both finding a new language in terms of being really responsive to signals, so being very responsive, learn to listen to both the tree but each other, and so in forming a community of listening, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one point. But I was wondering if there was more, like something in like you know the Lozengatari, the function of philosophy is always to create new concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So is this finding a new language also finding new concepts? So really at symbolic level, that allows us to discuss this new listening, to being interrelated, to co-create reality, being created and creating it, or it is only like a movement towards being more just embodied by rejecting the more symbolic.
That's a beautiful question. So I would land that in the following way. So when I talked about naming, I was pointing towards that a little bit. Sort of like the naming is a creative act. So on the one hand, we learn language, we receive language, so to say. On the other hand, when we use a language, we use it to transform the world somehow, right? So naming, for instance, is I call this a badiboo, and then it is a badiboo, and it wasn't a badiboo before. So there's something that changed in our meaningful world. Conceptual naming, identifying, creating new concepts, is just an extension of that, right? So I struggle, but maybe that's me, envisioning, certainly me in my position as the teacher who's been talking about this all the time, envisioning a humanity in which we don't do that, in which we do not conceptualize the world around us, in which we do not give deeper meanings to the experiences that we have, that transcend the experiences themselves, that conceptualize them at a different level. What I can imagine is that we might be less obsessive about it than we are now, maybe, in the way of the knowledge production, as we are putting it central in modern times, where everything has to be knowledge and everything has to be reconceptualized, etc., etc. This endless running from concept to concept to concept to concept to concept, which is not philosophy what you're talking about, right? It's sort of at a flatter level, but still, I hope we can get less neurotic in that regard.
Have you personally felt inspire with feel like, or is it more just an idea at this stage?
How do I answer this? There are moments where I can certainly, if I meditate or I'm in nature in a certain mindset, there's an encounter that happens between me and a tree or a flower or whatever that transcends an ordinary sort of a flatness of everyday life, where the encounter takes place in terms of this finitude, that there's this deep experience of you tree are something that transcends so far from my ability to know you. And yet at the same time, I do know a little bit of you. I can stand in a meaningful encounter with you. That is a part that I can experience. What I am completely deaf, blind, and dumb in is feeling the feedback loops that I was talking about. So that sort of conceptual language that I brought in from books, but not so much from experience.
That gave me a question, but so then you just said that you can have encounters with a tree, for example, that transcends the flatness of ordinary life. And what do you think it's possible to have this feeling in ordinary life? And have you ever experienced that, or is it? I don't know. Can you have the same thing with the tea kettle, or
Yeah.
Where are the objects in this?
Every encounter can take place the way I feel it in two modalities. One is one of flatness, and the other is one of wonder. The object doesn't determine the encounter, the quality of the encounter. It is the openness that you bring to it. So that a glass can become, if I only allow the question of what are you, can become a source of everyday wonder, everyday puzzlement, everyday access to something that is beyond anything that I can experience, even though it's banal as anything. There's no reason why we can't, except that it's not very handy. It's not very efficient. It's something that doesn't produce anything tangible that you can then say, hey, I've done a lot of work. It is mapped out typically on the side of either personal sensitivities or spirituality, things that are considered to be private and not particularly of any public value. But I would be very much of the inclination of bringing it back into the public realm. Heidegger talks about a table maker, for instance, a beautiful example where he says, if you want to be a craftsperson, you're not building a flat surface out of a piece of material that is called wood. No, you engage with the wood such that you allow it to bring forth a table that is already somehow in that wood. That kind of engagement with a piece of wood would require that openness, that sense of wonder, that awareness that the wood transcends my ability to control, to know, to master, to manipulate according to my will. So that the wood carving then becomes a thing that is actually carved between me and the piece of wood, as a co-creation, as such. And that is a language and an approach that is, in traditional craftsmanship, completely not a strange phenomenon. Right? You go with the material in a way that allows you to take the material in a more fuller form rather than just an object with properties.
understand this, whether this can only, like this kind of transformation of like rethinking and relearning is only possible in collapse, throughout collapse. Because the way I see it, it requires a huge amount of humility. And humans aren't trained to be humble, they're not trained to be receptive, because fundamentally everybody's insecure and we're torn in this world in which like insecurities just pile up, and then you have this process of self-positioning in order to overcome those, but we're not really receptive of our environments. So, because Martin asked about the neighborhood level, and I see that because I don't really understand how I would talk to my father like this and find common ground here. And so the only option I have is if the world really breaks down, if it's really about collapse, and if experience is kind of forced upon you, and humility, because I don't really see it as something we can learn currently. Like maybe some, but not everyone. And that excludes me. Like I don't think I can. Like I'm not saying like it's the other that can't. I can't.
I think it was very close to what was earlier asked about escaping the paradigm. Maybe we don't necessarily need collapse, but we need a tear in our social structure. We need our social structure to rip open a little bit, because the social structure that we inhabit makes us play roles, right? And uphold. That's where the upholding of things is constantly trying to be something that we're actually not completely in, and the sort of we're running in a world that Heidegger calls inauthentic, which is basically trying to fit in a texture that gives us status, that gives us recognition, gives us all kinds of stuff, but at the denial of what we experience as something that is authentic, and that is very close to us. To get to that authentic, that moment that you call it humble, but I find that a very Christian word and very problematic in a sense, that it feels like an act of self-humiliation or something. Humble is just finding yourself to be small. Right? That's humble, properly speaking. Just encountering yourself as insignificant and not powerful and small and tiny. That encounter, that truth to your own being in that sense, that comes when the social texture ruptures somehow, when you are torn out of it. That can come through marginalization. It can come through social change. It can come through you just going screw you and getting on a sailboat and trying to move away from social life somehow. It can also come from you playing with being awkward in social environments and doing stuff that make people really frown, and then you tearing yourself out of your social expectations somehow through that. But it needs to tear a little bit. It needs to rip open a little bit so that you can get back to something that's more authentic.
Yeah, it's a question which is relatively similar to ones asked already. But we're talking about a paradigm shift which doesn't come from a community level. And I just fail to see somehow how we as humanity, which has in the past largely failed to work on a community level, should come together on a community level and work towards something as abstract as climate change, which is a very abstract and hard to grasp concept, especially seeing that we're going to have certain effects of climate change which is going to be felt in the very soon future, which is going to have huge polarizing sort of shifts or like effects on community levels or societies. Say, for example, climate refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we, just generally, how can we achieve this working together, coming together? And when we talk about the society sort of rupture, what are you exactly talking about, and how large does it have to be? When is it going to come? Just to show some kind of thoughts.
So modernity is a war against community. Because communities are always local, they're always in places where things are significantly different than in other places, and modern life is about regularizing, standardizing, creating mass societies, which we can then administer, etc., etc. So there's no coincidence that dwelling places, communities are going to be sort of the response to the paradigm shift of the puzzle that we're facing right now, our modern thought, where everything comes with this global view, right? If you have a mass society and you want to make a change, you need to position yourself above it, and then you have an overview of it all, and then you can start making changes. So this is the epistemology of modern mass societies. And this is how you narrate your question. Looking from above, how can communities change the whole picture? So you see what I mean? Yeah. Sort of, and then I am completely with you. They don't. That's not going to happen. That is. They are the prime victims of modern life. They're not going to be able to solve it, I think, as the key or as the only kind of solution. So no. In this sense, I'm much more of a pessimist in the sense that I feel that the texture is breaking down. The story of the old is cracking. The way climate change and the Anthropocene is going to be responding to humans, and how humans are going to respond to that is going to create all kinds of ruptures in our textures. And in those gaps, there's opportunity, right? Then the old textures break down, and then new communities can form. That would be where my hope lies, but not something that we can just activate right now, just out of that, out of the blue. And then we're back to an earlier question, like, yeah, then there's maybe two levels that we have to work on. Thank you very much, guys.